Hi. So I said in my other video that I wanted to give us working in education reform, a feeling of hope in what seems like an intractable problem. And one of the statements I made is that when you start to measure the complexity involved, the problem of education reform, which I'm taking from the solution end or programs end of how do you meet individual user needs at a much more effectively than we are now with multiple solutions, multiple categories of solutions. If we take that as a problem, as the problem statement, how do we achieve that, not get snagged up as we are at the moment? That it's a dramatically simpler problem, tens of thousands of times simpler as a problem than things like climate change or fixing global poverty. So this seems like quite a statement. So let me justify that a little bit. When I started working on Workstream 1 in FED, on vision and purpose of education, I was reading a book by Bill Gates on climate change and his analysis of climate change as a problem and the solutions being put forward, worked on at different stages of being proven out. And I couldn't help in constantly in reading that book thinking, and how would you apply that genius's way of thinking to education reform? And so the way he breaks it down, first of all, I think we tend to, as a layman in the field of climate change for sure, think of it mostly as being about green energy. And so the first thing Bill points out is that green energy is like 27% of global emissions are down to clean energy. So there's really a whole slew of other things. The problem's much bigger than just energy. So he says getting around planes, trucks and cargo ships. So that's not just around how do you produce the energy is 27%. It's how do you have technologies in those transport industries where it's a green approach. Next is growing things, animals and plants. So getting around, as distinct from producing the energy, is 16%. Growing things, plants and animals, is 19%. A huge amount of the fossil fuels used is fertilizer. Believe it or not, that's one of the really massive things. Then making things, cement, steel and plastics, 31%. Keeping warm and cool, heating, cooling, refrigeration, 7%. So then in terms of this model of complexity, where I've said a successful industry is kind of where we got to, and when I ran through this little vignette, I think to people in education reform, and I said this is versus an individual coming up with a particular solution to a particular problem in education, we call that a one as a complex problem. Having a successful industry, we said, is 10 to the power 10, which is 10 billion. It's a lot. But if we take the 10 billion, the successful industry, as a unit now, and compare, because that's the level of complexity that's needed to solve education reform, okay? But what Bill Gates is talking around in the problem of climate change, how many industries are there, okay? So you've got planes, trucks, cargo ships, 3 different industries. Plants, animals, two massive areas within agriculture, electricity, making things, cement, steel, plastics, There's 3 different industries there. Keeping warm and cool, heating, cooling, refrigeration. So all different. So how many industries would need to be fundamentally reformed to solve climate change? Is that, 10, 15 different industries? So it's 10 to 15 times more difficult as a problem already. And I'm going to come on to some other things that makes it much harder, actually, climate change, than just the number of industries involved. And you can say, well, so the hope is they're making a lot of progress in climate change. Green energy. Look at the, wind and solar and tidal and waves and all the different approaches that are making dramatic progress of, big proportion of the UK's energy is now from renewable sources, which is amazing. And you could say, oh, well, that's all very well, they're making progress in that area. Why? But education reform is much more difficult. So, well, why? I imagine when early, 3 decades ago, when Margaret Thatcher said, no generation's got a freehold interest on the earth. I imagine if you went to the chairman of BP and said, oh yeah, we're going to have green energy, they'd have said, you're from Mars, you've lost it. It's impossible, it's ridiculous. It probably would have seemed ridiculous back then. And I think the progress that's happened in that field's astounding. So we can make progress in one industry. We can make progress. So next, here's some other problems that make it even more difficult than just the number of industries involved. Okay, so the grid. There isn't a national grid for electricity in the United States. It's a number of regional grids. And there needs to be a national grid to solve the energy problem, because there's a difference between north and south. And so in the winter, in the north, they need massive amounts of energy for heating. And other times, so they need to solve the problem of producing energy in some regions and move it to other regions. There isn't a national grid, a small problem. Most countries aren't comfortable being reliant on other countries for their energy needs. So if you take Europe, and there's the same issue of, a number of regional grids. There needs to be a number of national grids, let's say, within countries, but there isn't a regional grid within Europe, and the countries don't trust each other. Grid-level energy storage solutions don't exist. There isn't a reliable method of evening out peaks and troughs. 860 million people don't have reliable access to energy. Half the people in sub-Saharan Africa aren't even on the grid. So you need to build a grid. So, I'm just pointing out there's some major problems that we don't have to the same degree in education reform. Some countries aren't suitable for either solar or wind or both, yet might have low credit ratings that make it hard to finance big investments in new power plants. Okay, so that's just energy. Right, rich countries versus the developing world. So primarily in education reform, I think we can do most of what we need just with the UK solution. Not so with the climate agenda. You need international cooperation. You need countries, some of whom hate each other, to agree. So rich countries versus developing world. Rich countries subsidize the use of fossil fuels to ensure long-term energy security. In the US government, fossil fuel subsidies in 2018 were $400 billion. There's a direct correlation between increased economic development and increased carbon emissions. So the typical Kenyan produces 55 times less carbon dioxide than an American. So there's massive conflicts of interest globally in having global cooperation. The rapid increase in emissions in the developing world means that global emissions will be much greater in the future. So some of the things he proposes are around, we won't completely get to net zero, and we need, and if we do, we won't get there for some decades, and we need in the meantime ways of, coastal defences and ways of adjusting to climate change, not just the emissions problem. So outdated regulations. So we do have a problem of trying to align the regulations in education with the needs of young people. But so, for example, there's low carbon forms of concrete that are just as strong as normal concrete, but building regulations prohibit the use because they didn't exist when the building code was enacted. So there are multiple examples where outdated regulations don't allow the available solutions to be deployed. So I'd say this problem does exist in education reform as well. Right, technologies that don't exist and have to be invented. So I don't think we've got that in education reform, but look at this, listen to this list. It says 20 technologies that Bill Gates has identified, one of which is nuclear fusion. So there's like tens of billions of investment going into nuclear fusion. And that's just one. Right, hydrogen produced without emitting carbon, grid scale energy storage, electricity storage that can last a fuel season, electrofuels, advanced biofuels, zero carbon cement, zero carbon steel, plant and cell-based meat and dairy, zero carbon fertilizer, next generation nuclear fission, nuclear fusion, carbon capture, both direct air capture and point capture, underground electricity transmission, zero carbon plastics, geothermal energy, pumped hydro, thermal storage, drought and food tolerant food crops, zero carbon alternatives to palm oil, coolants that don't contain F-gases. And the investment required and the time to pay it back. So in education reform, I think the technologies basically exist now. I think, you know, we've got an issue where not every student has access to an acceptable quality of internet connected device or an acceptable quality of internet connectivity. So that you know, we see that in National Talent Academy in our schools that young people are lacking that as a consistent thing across the piece. I think even within schools, I think the connectivity and quality of devices is substandard compared with what we at a consumer level or business level think everyone has, and they don't in schools. So we do have some issues and some investment required, but it's a pittance compared to that laundry list of Bill Gates's. So hopefully they're making a ton of progress in climate agenda, and our problem in education reform is dramatically simpler. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times simpler, I think, honestly. And so we can do it too. Thank you.